The slap echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. Evelyn gasped, clutching her cheek, eyes wide in disbelief. She had never been hit before, not by anyone, and certainly not by her own son. Damian stood before her, breathing heavily, his 16-year-old face twisted with rage. "I told you not to touch my things," he shouted. His phone lay shattered on the marble floor, the screen completely destroyed. Evelyn's hands shook as she touched her burning cheek. She had only tried to confiscate his phone after catching him watching something inappropriate. But now, as she stared at her son, she realized something. This wasn't just a spoiled child. This was something much worse. The door burst open, and Chief Maxwell stormed in. "What is going on here?" Before Evelyn could speak, Damian pointed at her like an accusing child. "She broke my phone," he yelled, his voice shaking. Maxwell's face darkened. His gaze snapped to Evelyn. "Why would you do that?" Evelyn let out a sharp laugh, one filled with disbelief. "Maxwell, he slapped me." Silence. A long, painful silence. Then Maxwell sighed, as if tired of the entire situation. "Evelyn, he's just a boy. You shouldn't have broken his phone." Evelyn staggered backward, staring at her husband like he had gone mad. "Did you hear what I just said? He hit me." Maxwell shook his head, already reaching for his wallet. "I'll buy him a new phone. Damian, don't worry." Damian smirked. That smirk. Evelyn's stomach turned. He had won. She saw it now. The way his shoulders relaxed. The way his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This wasn't a moment of anger. This was control. Power. He had just hit his own mother and his father had rewarded him. Evelyn clenched her fists. Her heart pounded in her chest. "You're raising a monster, Maxwell." Maxwell scoffed. "Stop overreacting." Overreacting. She looked at Damian again. The boy who once held her hand when he was scared of the dark. The boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. Now he was standing there, smirking at her pain. Her stomach twisted in fear. He was turning into something dangerous, and Maxwell was blind to it. The next day, Evelyn sat at the dining table, her fingers tightening around her teacup. Across from her, Maxwell scrolled through his phone while Damian devoured his breakfast, acting like nothing had happened. The doorbell rang. A maid rushed to open it, and within seconds, their furious neighbor, Mr. Ifeanyi, stormed inside, dragging his 12-year-old son along. The boy's face was swollen, his lip cracked. Maxwell sighed, clearly annoyed. "What is it this time? What is it this time?" Ifeanyi's voice shook with anger. "Your son? Your demon of a son did this." He gestured at his bleeding child. Damian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "He started it," he said lazily. "Started it?" Ifeanyi's voice cracked. "He was playing in the compound. Your son dragged him into a corner and beat him." Maxwell sighed again, rubbing his temple. "Kids fight. It's normal." Evelyn's eyes widened in horror. "Maxwell, no. This is not normal." Maxwell waved his hand dismissively. "Ifeanyi, how much do you want?" Ifeanyi's nostrils flared. "You think money can fix everything? This is not the first time. One day Damian will hurt someone beyond repair." Damian chuckled. That sound, that cold, heartless laugh. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. "You'll regret this, Maxwell," Ifeanyi whispered, his voice filled with something Evelyn had never heard before. Pity. And then he left. Evelyn turned to Maxwell, desperate. "Maxwell, please, he's out of control." Maxwell shook his head and sipped his coffee. "He's just a boy." Those words again. Evelyn felt something inside her snap. No, Damian was not just a boy. He was a storm, and when he finally struck, the destruction would be unstoppable. sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ifeanyi's son's bruised face. She saw Damian's smirk. She saw Maxwell's blindness. She got up and walked down the dark hallway, stopping outside Damian's door. She hesitated. Then slowly she pushed it open. Inside, Damian sat at his desk, his back to her, playing a game on his laptop. "Damian," she said softly. He didn't turn around. "Damian, look at me." Slowly, he turned. His face was blank, his eyes empty. "You hit me," she whispered. "And you feel nothing, do you?" Damian blinked. Then a small smirk formed on his lips. "You shouldn't have touched my phone." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Damian, I am your mother." His expression didn't change. "So?" Her heart broke. She stepped back, the realization sinking in. Her son was gone, and she was staring into the eyes of a stranger. The next morning, Evelyn made a decision. She would not let Maxwell continue destroying their son. She would do what a mother should do. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Good morning, Principal Adisa," she said, her voice steady. "I need a meeting with you. It's about my son." She was going to fix this, no matter what it took. But she had no idea that this decision would cost her everything. What will happen next? Will Evelyn succeed in stopping Damian? Or is it already too late? The Cost of Blind Love, Part 2. Evelyn sat in the principal's office, hands clenched into fists on her lap. Across from her, Principal Adisa sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Mrs. Maxwell," he said slowly, "I understand your concerns, but this isn't the first time Damian has been reported. He's had multiple complaints, bullying, fighting, even threatening teachers." Evelyn's heart pounded. "Then why hasn't anything been done?" The principal hesitated. "Because your husband sues anyone who tries to discipline his son." Evelyn's breath caught. Of course, Maxwell had used his power and money to shield Damian from consequences. "I am begging you," Evelyn whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. "If this continues, my son will turn into a monster." Principal Adisa looked at her for a long moment. Then finally he sighed. "I'll see what I can do." Evelyn exhaled, feeling hope for the first time in years. But she had no idea that by stepping into that office, she had just signed her own death sentence. That evening, Damian stormed into the house, his face twisted in rage. He slammed his backpack onto the floor. "Mom!" he roared. "What did you do?" Evelyn froze. She had never seen him this angry before. "Damian, calm down." "Calm down?" He took a step toward her, his entire body shaking. "You told the principal about me? Do you know what happened today?" Evelyn swallowed. "What?" "They punished me," Damian spat. "They made me apologize to the students I bullied. They made me stand in front of the whole class while the teacher insulted me." Evelyn felt a flicker of something. Guilt? No. Satisfaction. For the first time, her son had faced consequences. "Good," she said softly. Damian's eyes darkened. "You're going to regret this." The next day, Evelyn was in the kitchen when her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A deep voice came through the line. "Mrs. Maxwell, I regret to inform you that your services are no longer needed at St. Mary's Academy." Evelyn's body went cold. "What?" The voice remained emotionless. "You have been dismissed." The call ended. Evelyn slowly lowered the phone. No. She had been a teacher at that school for 10 years. It was her passion, her life. And now, she suddenly understood. Maxwell. Damian had told him about the punishment, and Maxwell had retaliated the only way he knew how, by destroying her career. Her vision blurred. This wasn't just about Damian anymore. Maxwell was the real problem. And for the first time, Evelyn felt something she had never felt before. Hate. That night, Evelyn confronted Maxwell in his study. "You got me fired." Her voice was eerily calm. Maxwell didn't even look up from his laptop. "You shouldn't have gone behind my back." Evelyn clenched her fists. He needed to be punished. Maxwell sighed and finally looked at her. "Evelyn, you need to stop this obsession. He's just a boy." Evelyn let out a hollow laugh. "A boy who hit his own mother. A boy who beats up other children for fun. A boy who blackmails teachers. And you keep making excuses for him." Maxwell's face hardened. "I'm protecting my son." "No," Evelyn whispered. "You're destroying him." A thick silence filled the room. Then Maxwell leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold. "This conversation is over." Evelyn took a deep breath. "Fine." She turned and walked away, but inside she was already planning her next move. Because if Maxwell refused to stop Damian, she would do it herself. But Evelyn didn't know that she had just made her final mistake, and in a few days she would never wake up again. The Cost of Blind Love. Part 3. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Evelyn lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She had to do something. If Maxwell wouldn't stop Damian, then she would. Tomorrow she would pack her bags and leave. But she wouldn't go alone. She would take Damian with her. She had already called her sister in another city. She would enroll Damian in a strict boarding school, away from his father's influence, away from the power that had poisoned him. It was the only way to save her son. Evelyn exhaled and turned to the side. She never saw the shadow standing at her door. The next morning, the house was eerily silent. Maxwell stretched as he stepped out of his room. The air smelled of fresh coffee. Evelyn must have been up early, but when he entered the kitchen, she wasn't there. He frowned. Strange. He checked the living room. Empty. "Evelyn?" he called. Silence. A chill crawled up his spine. He hurried to the bedroom. The bed was untouched. No sign of her. Panic rose in his chest. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned sharply. Damian stood there, staring at him. Maxwell's breath caught. There was something different about his son today. His usual arrogance was gone. His face was blank, and his eyes were empty. "Where's your mother?" Maxwell asked, his voice tense. Damian tilted his head, his lips curling into a small smile. "She left." Maxwell's heart pounded. "What do you mean she left?" "She said she couldn't take it anymore. She packed a bag and left last night." Maxwell felt his stomach drop. "That's impossible." Damian shrugged. "Check the closet." Maxwell rushed to the wardrobe. Evelyn's suitcase was gone, but something was wrong. Her phone was still on the bedside table. Maxwell picked it up, his hands shaking. Evelyn would never leave without her phone. A heavy weight settled in his chest. Something wasn't right. Days passed. Evelyn was officially declared missing. Maxwell filed a report. He hired private investigators. He even offered a reward for information. But there was nothing. No messages, no calls, no sightings. It was as if Evelyn had vanished into thin air. One night, Maxwell sat in his study, staring at a photo of his wife. His heart ached. He had been so cruel to her. He should have listened. He should have seen the pain in her eyes. A tear slipped down his cheek. Then he heard a soft knock on his door. He wiped his face quickly. "Come in." Damian stepped inside, his face calm. Maxwell sighed. "Damian, I miss her too, Dad," Damian said. His voice was gentle, almost too gentle. Maxwell swallowed the lump in his throat. She wouldn't have left like this. Damian nodded. Maybe she finally had enough. Maxwell looked at his son. Do you think she's okay? Damian's lips curved into a slow, chilling smile. I don't think we'll ever see her again. Maxwell's blood ran cold. He stared at his son, his heart pounding. There was something in Damian's eyes, something dark, something that sent a shiver down his spine. Evelyn was gone, and deep down, Maxwell knew his son had something to do with it. But the worst was yet to come. What really happened to Evelyn? Will Maxwell ever discover the truth? The Cost of Blind Love, Part 4. The weight of Evelyn's disappearance never left the house. The air inside felt heavy, suffocating. Maxwell tried to act normal, to believe his wife had just left. But he couldn't. Not with the way Damian watched him. Not with the way his son never asked about his mother. It was as if Damian had already moved on, and that terrified Maxwell. One evening, Maxwell sat in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then he heard laughter, Damian's laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter a boy should have after losing his mother. It was light, playful, amused. Maxwell stood, his pulse quickening. He followed the sound. It led him to Damian's room. He hesitated. Then slowly he pushed the door open. Damian was sitting on his bed, his phone in his hand, smiling at the screen. Maxwell frowned. What's funny? Damian looked up, startled for a brief moment. Then his usual smirk returned. Nothing, he said, slipping his phone under his pillow. Maxwell narrowed his eyes. Let me see your phone. Damian chuckled. Why? I said, let me see it. Damian sighed dramatically. Dad, don't you trust me? Maxwell didn't answer. He walked toward the bed. Damian's body tensed. For the first time in a long time, Maxwell felt fear of his own son. He reached under the pillow, grabbed the phone, and stepped back before Damian could stop him. The screen was still open. A video was playing. Maxwell's breath caught in his throat. It was Evelyn, his wife. Her face was pale, her lips trembled, her eyes, red and swollen, were filled with terror. Maxwell's hands began to shake. Evelyn was speaking. Her voice was weak. She was crying. Damian, please. I won't tell your father. Just let me go. Please, son. Then the screen went black. Maxwell felt like he was going to vomit. He turned to his son. Damian was grinning, like it was a game, like he had just won. Maxwell's chest tightened. His head spun. His son, his own son, had done something unspeakable. Maxwell took a shaky step back. What did you do to her? Damian's smile didn't fade. She left, Dad. His voice was calm. Too calm. She just didn't say goodbye properly. Maxwell's whole body froze. There was no more doubt. Damian had killed his mother, and he had been laughing about it. The truth was out. But what would Maxwell do now? Would he turn his son in, or would he cover up the ultimate crime, just like he had always done? The cost of blind love had never been higher. The final part is coming. Where are you watching this? Comment your country. The Cost of Blind Love, Part 5, Final Part. Maxwell stood frozen, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The weight of the truth crushed him. His son had killed Evelyn. The room spun. His breathing was shallow. The air felt too thick, pressing down on him. Damian sat there, relaxed, smirking like this was nothing. Maxwell wanted to speak. He wanted to scream. He wanted to do something. But all he could do was stare at the monster he had created. His own son. A murderer. And he had spent his whole life protecting him. Damian stood up slowly. too slowly. "Dad," he said, his voice almost amused. "You're looking at me like you just realized who I am." Maxwell didn't move, didn't blink. "You always fixed my mistakes, Dad," Damian continued, tilting his head slightly. "What's different this time?" Maxwell's blood ran cold. Damian took a step closer. "You always cleaned up after me. When I bullied those kids, when I got that teacher fired, when I..." He chuckled. "When I did things I wasn't supposed to." Maxwell's breathing became shaky. Damian grinned. "You're not going to break the cycle now, are you?" He was taunting him, like he knew Maxwell wouldn't do anything, like he knew Maxwell was too much of a coward to act. And that was the moment it hit him. Damian wasn't just evil. He was testing him to see if he would be the same weak father he had always been. No, not this time. Maxwell took a slow step back, his mind racing. "You killed your mother," he whispered, more to himself than to Damian. Damian just shrugged. She was in the way. In the way. That was all she was to him, his own mother. Maxwell's whole body started shaking. Evelyn was dead, gone, because of him. Because he had refused to raise his son the right way. Because he had chosen blindness over discipline. And now he had to make a choice. Did he protect his son again? Or did he finally do what he should have done years ago? The next morning, Maxwell sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. Damian was in the house, sleeping, completely unaware. Maxwell had been awake all night. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat, he just thought. And in the silence, one thought refused to leave him. "What will you do, Maxwell?" He had spent years ignoring Damian's sins. He had paid for his crimes. But some sins couldn't be washed away with money. Some sins needed justice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Then, with shaky fingers, he called the police. When they arrived, Damian woke up to the sound of sirens. He ran downstairs, confused. And then, he saw his father, standing outside, waiting. Damian's eyes darted from the officers to Maxwell. He laughed. "This is a joke, right?" he said. Maxwell didn't answer. Damian's smile slowly faded. His father wasn't joking. "No," Damian whispered. "No, no, no, you wouldn't." Maxwell looked him in the eye, and for the first time in Damian's life, his father didn't look afraid of him. He looked done. Two officers grabbed Damian's arms. He started screaming, thrashing. "Dad, you can't do this. Dad, stop." But Maxwell didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. Damian was dragged into the police car, kicking and screaming. Maxwell just stood there, his face unreadable. And then, just as the car door slammed shut, Damian's voice broke. "Dad, you're supposed to protect me." The words cut deep, but Maxwell didn't look away, because he wasn't protecting Damian anymore. He was protecting the world from him. As the sirens faded into the distance, Maxwell finally let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His hands were shaking. His heart was heavy. But for the first time in his life, he had done the right thing, even if it had come too late.